Hey guys, welcome back to week 9 of Web Design Decal. This is Howie. Hopefully you guys had a great Halloween weekend and ate a good amount of candy. So as you can tell, there is no live lecture today. Hopefully by now you voted already. So hopefully election day is going well for you. So today we're going to talk about how JavaScript meets HTML and CSS. So last week what Nick talked about was just basic JavaScript syntax and these things, but we didn't really talk about how it should interact with our websites, which we'll be going into today. So before we go into the content, of course, there's some announcements. Just a reminder that Homework 7 is due tomorrow, Wednesday at 7 p.m. instead of Tuesday, because today is election day. And so we wanted to give you time to vote today. And so Homework 7 is due tomorrow. However, we are releasing Homework 8 tonight. And that'll be due next Tuesday. So all these coming homeworks are going to be back to regular schedule due Tuesdays. Homework 8 is going to be a great practice for you to show off these skills that you learned from lecture today about interacting with websites from JavaScript. And of course, final project was released early last week. It should be more than enough time to get things done. Just a reminder that check-in is due November 12th, the Thursday. So it's like next Thursday. So it's a week and a half already. So please get that done soon. And then the overall project is due December 1st. So another half month after the check-in. So again, plenty of time to work on this. And of course, since we did project presentations for midterm projects, the top projects for this we'll also do presentations, and you can be featured on our showcase website that we show off every semester and that most people go to when looking at our decals. So that's a cool incentive. And a reminder that final project submission is through this link, wdd.io/go project submit. You're not submitting on Portal. I can't emphasize that enough. You won't submit any files on Portal because you're actually hosting this your website on a real live URL that people can actually visit on like a browser. So please keep that in mind. You're only submitting a URL link. Any files that you submit on Portal will not be counted. And if you don't submit on form, it'll be a late project submission. So please keep that in mind. And of course, we have office hours and feedback if you have anything. So let's just get into it. Today on the agenda, we have a good amount of stuff to talk about. It's pretty hefty today. So I definitely, like I mentioned last lecture, if you have just like the slightest confusion on a topic in JavaScript or just anything in general, please don't hesitate to ask us. We are here to help you understand these concepts to the fullest, because these topics really rely on previous knowledge and they start to snowball if you have like some confusion here and then you try to just learn other things later on in the coming weeks with that confusion. It's not going to work out well for you. So again, please come out to office hours or lab, or just like post on Piazza if you have any questions at all. And of course, there's no such thing as stupid questions. So please get those resolved as soon as you can, so that you can really understand these concepts well. So let's just, first things first, we're going to review some variables and functions that Nick went through last lecture. It's going to be pretty brief because I assume that you watched last week's lecture and you did the homework too. So just a reminder that variables, they are variables like in math. I'm sure you've taken math classes before, like X, Y, Z, these variables. They're the same thing, because when we use a variable, we want to store a value of something and give it a name. So in our case, we have two lines of JavaScript code. The first variable we create, or the first line, it's going to be a new variable. Like Nick mentioned, we have to say let variable name, because we are creating a new one for the first time. So again, let name equals a string Asia, semicolon. So remember, strings are in quotes, and that's if we're storing text. So they have to be in quotes at all times. So if there weren't quotes and it was just Asia, the word, what JavaScript is going to do instead is that it's going to say, okay, Asia. I'm going to look for a variable called Asia in my JavaScript file, which doesn't exist. So it's going to error and break my page, or not really break my page, but it's going to break my code. So if you're storing text, it has to be in quotes. That's why we call it a string, or else it's going to think it's a variable name. And then the second line, we're doing the same thing. We're creating another new variable. That's why we say let again. Let age. This time we call the name age equals 21. So this is a number, so there's no quotes in it because it's a number value. I mean, if you wanted a string 21, you could also put it in quotes and it'd be a string. But in this case, without a string, it'll be an integer type. So yeah, and we generally want to make our variable names meaningful so that we're not naming XYZ like ABCD, things like that. And then when we go to review your code, it's just like, what the heck is like A? I don't understand. So generally name your variables to be pretty meaningful, usually a noun. And also a side tangent is Nick posted a really good Piazza post about like ES6 versus JavaScript. If you're into like this detailed version of JavaScript, how you can create variables and things, you should check that post out. It shouldn't be that far down the post history, so definitely check his post out. And then more review with variables. We can call our variable multiple times. So let's say we have our age. This time it's 20 plus 5, so age is just 25, the number. But we have this line age minus 2.5. And this wouldn't really make sense in JavaScript because the browser would give you an error if you do this line. Because it doesn't make sense to just call the age number, which is 25 minus 2.5, but not do anything with the value. So we do the computation, 25 minus 2.5, we get 22.5. But then the value of 22.5 is going to be lost forever since it's not stored anywhere. So you notice how the first line we say let age equals 20 plus 5. So age is saved forever, or until we change it again, to the value 25. If we just did 20 plus 5 in that one line, there's no point. The computer just did some useless computation of 20 plus 5 and then just deleted that 25 value because it's not being saved anywhere. Same thing for age minus 2.5. We're not saving it to a specific value. However, here, this is correct. On the third line, we say age equals age times 2. So you notice how we said age twice? We mentioned the same variable twice. It just means we're using the old value and reassigning it to the same variable name. So in this case, when age, we do age times 2. So age is 25 because this line, the second line didn't go through. Again, value was lost. 25 times 2 is 50. So now we assign 50 to age again. So now after this third line, age is now 50. So when you modify a variable, remember to reassign it or put it in a new variable. We could do 50 to a new variable, like let new age equals age times 2 or whatever, or this again. So you notice if we're reassigning a variable to a different value, because it's already created, we don't need the let again. That was an emphasis that Nick put in. So if you don't get this, please watch the previous lecture from last week. And then also functions, we want to, let's say we define a function show greeting. There's a big difference between defining a function and calling a function. So here we define a function, but it never runs our function, or it doesn't do what we want until we call it, which is why after the show greeting function is declared or defined, we run it here in this line here where you say show greeting, and in the parameters we put an argument string miles. So when we run this, you can notice that we'll get an alert on our browser called and it'll say howdy miles ! So that's the difference. Please really understand the difference between defining and calling. Defining does not mean running. That's why there's a calling part for the function section. And then another example for using functions, like what if we want to save a value? And that's why we have a return statement in our function declaration. So here we have a function called square. We're just squaring a number. So x can be anything that we pass in. So we return x times x, which is the square of x. But again, we define the function here, but it doesn't mean that we call it. It doesn't run at all. So here we say, let y equals square of 5. So we pass in 5 as x. What it does here is that it will run the computation, does 5 times 5 is 25, and so we return 25. So now y, the variable name y, equals 25. And then consecutively in the line after, we say let z equals square of y. So in this case, y is already computed into 25 from the last line. So now we're just squaring 25 with itself. And we're doing the same thing and then assigning it to the z variable. So in this case, z after the square runs, the function run, square of 25 is 625, I believe. I can't do math to save my life though, so don't quote me on that. But z should be like 625, or the square of 25. So yeah. Remember that it's important to create a variable or reassign a variable value to the return of a function call, or else it's not going to be saved. If you just did square 5 on a line, you're computing it, but you're not saving it. So there's really no point of doing it. That's incorrect. So we're going to get into a new concept called objects in JavaScript. This is where it gets kind of complicated, but it really gets you thinking about the coming concepts I'm going to show you here. So what objects are, basically when we write code in JavaScript or whatever language you're writing, we're trying to convert the world and how we describe it in English or whatever language you're comfortable with to a representation that computers can understand. Because computers, if you speak to them in English, it's not going to really work out. They only understand code. And that gets into a very big detail about like really in-depth operating system stuff. That's I won't talk about that. But so far we've only talked about numbers, like integers and strings as types. But what if we want it to be a little bit more complex than that? And so that's why we introduce the notion of objects. The theme of this is that complex things like objects are just composed of simple things. So even though I'm introducing a new concept to you and you might be scared, it's literally just like Lego blocks. I'm making a complex thing out of simple things. And so let's just walk through an example of an object together. So objects in JavaScript are the language's way of representing more complex things. And so they are a collection of functions and variables, but within an object scope, we call them methods and properties respectively. And what I mean by that is, or I guess I'll show you a code in a sec, but like the theme is like, think about what you're trying to do in English, or again, whatever language you're comfortable with, before converting to code. So let's say I want to design a car. How would I make an object for this? So let's say like, what are the properties of a car? And you could probably argue that the properties of a car include the color of the car, the model, the current miles per hour is going at, or like even like the owner, whatever. You can make a lot of different properties. But what are some functions that we can create for a car too? Like what can a car do? So it can drive straight, it can brake, it can change colors, maybe not in real life, but in a game. And it could turn, things like that. So like you could use these examples for like maybe like a JavaScript game of a racing game you're designing. So these are really important first steps that you should take. Think of the things you're doing in English first before converting to code, because it can be very, very like rough when you just jump straight into code, unless you're like pretty used to it. So let's get a little closer to code. Like we've already thought about the English parts, what a car should have and what it does. So let's just think about what types of these properties should take on. And so for the properties, let's say color and model, these could be like a string, like just text, right? Color, quote in quotes, red, blue, yellow, these things, whatever. MPH, like the variable name MPH could be a number, so we don't need it to be in quotes. But it's just be an integer, whatever. And for the functions, we can just create functions, pretty straightforward. Like it's a drive straight function, a break function, and then a change color function. And in this case, we are able to pass in a color of our choice to change the color to. So that's why we have the color parameter set for change color function. And so, yeah, this is getting a little bit closer to code. Step by step, again, we're taking it very slowly. So now let's just get it into the pure code of an object, which honestly isn't that bad when you break it down. So we, again, on the left-hand side, we have everything defined from our previous slide, from our last step. So let's just get into the code. So we say let car equals. This is just defining a variable like normal. This is what you're used to. But now we open curly brackets, and this is what an object is represented as in JavaScript. So we open curly brackets, and then to end the object, it's close curly brackets, and then, of course, semicolon afterwards too. But within the curly brackets, we define all our properties and functions, or methods and variables, these things. So for our properties, this looks a lot awfully like CSS, right? Like it's not that much different except you have a comma, but not a semicolon like CSS. So in here, like our properties, we say color colon and then string red. So our color of this car is going to be red. Model colon and then string Tesla Model S. So it's going to be a red Tesla Model S. And then to separate the properties, again, commas across these. And then this one, I guess it's going to be just static. It's not going to be moving. So we say miles per hour 0 and it's a number. So those are our properties. We define these properties, and it's pretty straightforward. It looks like CSS kind of, but we define the properties of our car object. Next up, we have our three functions: drive straight, brake, and change color. This function declaration thing is a little bit different from what you're used to than we taught in the last week. But again, it should be pretty straightforward too. So in here we say drive straight colon, and it would be a function, and then open curly brackets, and then do whatever inside. We don't know. It'll just go straight. Like maybe it'll animate forward or something in your game, and then comma to go to make another variable, things like that. For our break function, same thing, same structure. Break colon function, whatever. And then in our case, do whatever, it'll break. And then change color function, new color. It takes in a variable new color, and then it'll change the color to that color, whatever. So this is an example of we created an object called car in our case, and we applied all of these different properties and functions to it. So now this car has a lot of different properties and functions it can possibly call. And wow, like you probably wondered, this is a ton of new syntax. Like it's so much to take in it for one slide. Don't worry, we're not making objects on our own. None of the homeworks or labs are going to be on this. Like you're not going to be creating objects. This is just for you to be able to recognize how variables can contain not just a number or a string in one line, but also objects, a little bit more complex things that have properties and functions. And it really builds up into the next couple of concepts I'll be teaching later in this lecture. So this is a really good intro to that. Again, you're not gonna be doing all this code. That's a little bit too much to ask. So you could breathe a sigh of relief. So the importance of me teaching you an object, these things like this concept is the concept of dot notation. So let's say we have our like car variable here. Like this is basically the same thing from the last slide, but now that we have properties and functions defined within the object, how do I like access them? Like what if I wanted to know what is the color of the car object? So in our case, we do console.log car.color. Ooh, a little fancier syntax for JavaScript here. So we notice that we did car, which is the object, dot color, which means I want to output the color of the car object. So in this case, console.log is going to return a result of red because that's the color of the car. And if we wanted to drive straight, we do car.driveStraight function call with the parentheses because it's a function, of course. So if we call this like car.driveStraight, you can imagine your car goes straight or like animates forward, whatever, on your game if you're creating a game like this. Same thing for a change color, like car.changeColor, and then we pass in a string blue. So we're changing our color to blue. So you could probably assume like blue, a color for in this property is now going to be blue instead of red, whatever. More detailed stuff about the code, but that's not important. The important part of this is that to call an object's function or to get the value stored in an object's property, we use dot notation, and that's the whole purpose of why I taught you object. So in a literal reality perspective, like let's put it like this. There are millions of red Tesla Model S's out there. Like there's really a lot. They make them every single day. So how do I know which one should drive straight or which one I want to change color? Like we can create like so many objects called like car 1, car 2, car 3, car 4, and they'll all have similar properties like red model Tesla Model S, but these are different unique objects. So if I do car 1 drive straight, only car 1 will drive, even though all the other cars have the same exact properties and functions as everything else because they're the same car model, right? But like that's the whole importance of dot notation, because we know what to refer to or which object to refer to. So in this case, since we only have one, it's easy to understand like car dot color is red, but like let's say all the Tesla Model S's, if I do car 1 dot color, it could be blue. If I do car 2 dot color, it could be green. I don't know, like things like this. So it's really important that you understand this dot notation. So if we said like all cars drive straight, like if you said all cars drive straight, we're going to get like a ton of car accidents. So it's really important to know which specific object you're referring to if there's multiple. So that was a little tangent of how the new like JavaScript complex system. I know it was a little bit but yeah. So let's just get back into how HTML and JavaScript meet, and which we'll talk about the DOM, or the Document Object Model. So let's just take, so this is just our HTML that you've probably seen from previous lectures. It's a list of food places in Berkeley. But on the right-hand side, we have a diagram of the JavaScript side constructed by the web browser, a very simplified version. And this is what the DOM looks like. So again, DOM stands for Document Object Model. And this is a lot of text, but basically, when the HTML page is loaded, JavaScript creates its own representation of the page, which is made up of objects. What you just learned in the previous slides. And each HTML tag is an object. So we have the structure here, which I'll go into detail or step by step later on, which each box is an object. So document is an object, body is an object, H1 is an object, even though you're used to them as seeing them as tags in HTML, but now you should be thinking them as objects in JavaScript. So document is really important to note because we'll be using this a lot. Document is basically a pre-loaded variable, you can call it, that loads up every time a web page is loaded. So this already exists, and which is why we can never name any variable in JavaScript document, because that name already exists. It's going to error out if you name it so don't name any variable document because that already exists. And you can see here, like each object has its own list of like functions, properties, like same thing for body. It has properties. We only listed out a couple, but like in reality, there's like hundreds of them, which is crazy. And I'll show you what I mean by hundreds in a demo later on. So we just listed the important ones for you to know. That's for the coming weeks. But yeah, all the HTML elements on the page have the same set. But this is like a sample diagram of the DOM. So let's just get into it. Again, like I said, document is preloaded. It's already built into all browsers. That's why, again, don't name any variables to document. And our focus for today is going to be get element by ID. So you can see that document has a function within it called get element by ID that only document can use, not anywhere else, not any other object. So it's good to note like that. So what is this function document.getElementById? by ID? So it's just like a very normal function that you create. It takes one argument, which is a string, which is the ID of the HTML element we want, and it returns that specific element object. So what I mean by that, let's look at this JavaScript code. Here we say let list element, so we just define, create a variable called list element, pretty self-explanatory. But now we use the document.getElement by ID function code, and we pass in a string, in quotes of course, because that's a string, of food list, food-list. So we have this HTML here, and so what this function is going to return to us is the object food list. And in this case, it's like the list, unordered list tag. And as you can see here, this is what is represented in our like visual. Like that's what list element is now. It's an object of food list. So you can see within our object we have pre-existing properties that are, again, that's what pre-existing means. They exist already, even without you defining it. So this is what's kind of available to us. Again, there's like hundreds, but these are the important ones I'll show you today. So let's just run through our code again. We get food list equals document.getElement by ID in quotes food list. So now we have the object we can use. So now we use dot notation to access food list property that are pre-built. So here we say console.log food list dot class list. So what this says in English is like, I want to know the class list of food list. And what this is going to return is a list structure in JavaScript of the class names in the UL food list object. So you can see in previous code, it had class equals blue box. And so that's what .classlist does. So foodlist.classlist returns a list structure of the class names that exist in the food list object. Don't worry about these hard bracket structure. We'll teach you that in like 2 weeks, I think. They're called lists and arrays. But the important thing to note is that .classlist returns all the class names of the object we're referring to. There's also .inner HTML, which basically outputs all the HTML code inside or nested inside of our tag or our object. So in this case, it's going to return a string of all the inside stuff. So in the inside stuff is like 3 li tags or list items because ordered list has 3 nested tags inside. And then for children, what's cool about children is that it's very similar to inner HTML, but it does give a list structure of all the children that are nested inside the tag or our object. So in this case, it'll give us 3 li tags, and that's because we have 3 li tags within it. And that's basically the parent-child hierarchy we've been explaining throughout this whole class. So yeah, that's what .children does. And again, these objects or properties are all pre-existing within this object. So these exist for any object you'll create ever. So why are we doing this again? Let's just recall some of our examples of interactive features from our last lecture. So when a user clicks on an image on the page, we want to increase its size. So to increase the size, what we mean in code is like we want to change the CSS width or height, whatever, either works. Also, when the user clicks on this button, then change colors to dark mode. And when we do code, what we actually mean by that in code is like change the CSS color and background color of whatever you want to change exactly. So when we convert these to actual code, then we get into the very detailed of like what I just explained. Like maybe this button is like we refer to as like document.getElement by ID dark mode button. Maybe that's the ID of the button itself. And now we have we're able to access this button, and that's done by this getElement by ID function that I just explained. And then to change CSS, I'll be going over that in the next couple of slides. Basically, this is where the interactive features begin. But yeah, so a little tangent from here. Another method we can select certain elements from the page or the HTML is through this document.querySelector thing. it's also a built-in function of document. So what this function does, it takes one argument, similar to getElementById, which is a string, which is a CSS selector of the HTML element we want. And this returns the first element object that matches the selector name. And this can be the same as document.getElementById, which I'll show you right here. So let's say we had the same list code as before, but this time we're just going to use query selector. So let's say let list element equals document.querySelector. But we select this one based off of ID. So that means for query selector, we need to include the CSS selector. This is the same format as what you would do for CSS, right? So you would include that in the string. So quotes, hashtag food-list. And this would output the same exact thing as if you do document.getElementById food list. Same thing. This is just another method to do it. What's cool about query selector is that you're not restricted to just ID selecting now. You can select anything you want on the page. So let's say we have the same code again, but we now use document.querySelector UL. So we're just selecting the UL tag. And this would, same thing, output the same exact object as the last slide. So another different method you could do this. Assuming that UL is the only UL tag that exists on the page. So what if there are multiple repeated names? Like let's say we have two divs called child with the class child. And we do let element equals document.querySelector .child because it's a class, of course, so .child. And what, like I said before, a couple slides ago, query selector will only select the very first occurrence of the CSS selector name. So it's going to look through our DOM or our HTML file. It's going to say child. Okay, that's the first one. Boom, done. It's not even going to bother looking at the rest. So this element variable is now the object of the first child div. So any changes you do to element will only change the first div. Like let's say you change the text inside. It's only going to affect the first div because, again, query selector only selects the first occurrence of that name. Cool. So I'm going to go through a quick demo of like an example. This is the same exact code, the list you've been seeing for the past like 10 slides or whatever. So I'm going to go to inspect element. And of course, you can see our code here, our HTML. I'm going to go to console. You should be familiar with this because of last lecture and homework. So let's just play around with this. Let's say I'm going to make a variable food list equals document. So you notice how I'm typing and it already like gives me suggestions. Get element. Wow, like get element by ID is already recommended. I press enter. I don't need to type it out. I'm too lazy. So I'm going to get element by ID food list. Boom. And it's going to return undefined because, of course, there's nothing to return. It's getting saved to food list. So what's cool about console is that I can just type the variable name out and it'll output the result. And this is unique to console because, like, if you did this in an actual code file, it's going to break your code because it wouldn't make sense for you to just do a variable name, call a variable name, and do nothing with it. So this is cool about console for inspect element because you can interact with it. So if I just did food list, I can just double check if the get element by ID function went through. And so that's why I see the UL tag. So clearly we selected the right things. And what's cool is that if I highlight over this stuff, it'll show the actual thing on the web page. So we can know finally that food list is selected property because the function went through. I'm going to make food list 2 and use query selector this time to show you that it's the exact same thing. Query selector hashtag food list. So let's do food list 2 now. Exact same thing, again, like I mentioned, there are multiple ways to select objects. Yeah. So now let's see the properties within food list. We do dot notation and then boom, like these are all the properties and functions that pre-exist in this object already. This is literally what I meant by hundreds. And there's way more than we can actually teach. So don't worry about a lot of these. So the ones that I taught you, class list, if I do that, it'll show, boom, like it showed a class list of the food list objects because the UL tag has a class called blue box. So that's why it shows blue box here. If we did food list dot, what was the other one? Inner HTML. And we did that. It gives me a string of all the HTML code inside of the food list object. If I did like food list dot children, boom, it'll give me a list object or a list structure of all the tags that exist inside, which in this case we can expand it. It could show like the 3 li tags we have inside the code. And that could go into depth of like what properties those have set, but that's just a little bit too much. So this is a great example of using console to show you exactly how I can use getElementById or query selector to select certain things on my page. So yeah, let's just get back into the slides. So now we are able to select elements. We get, like I said, we're going to get into the interactive feature. Let's just start adding CSS classes to add or remove CSS classes to JavaScript from JavaScript. So it turns out that the class list property of an object is not just a list, but rather another object within itself. So basically, now our code goes like, we start with document, and this is the object. We're just going to go step by step to show you how JavaScript works. So document, starts with the document object. I'm going to use the function getElementById that exists within document to get my food list object on the page. And now we're at this part where we have our food list object, and we have this object to use. And then we access the food list.classList property that exists within the food list object, and that'll return an object, again, because ClassList is an object, and within it also exists other functions like add, remove, toggle, and I'll show you what that means. So we can see here that the output of .ClassList is the class blue box, and so this is how we can change CSS with JavaScript. So again, we have our regular .getElementById food list. So now we have the food list object on our in our food list object or variable name, and we print out the class list, which gives out the blue box like normal. Showed this a couple slides ago, but now we can utilize one of its functions that exists within the class list object. We add dark mode class to class list, which is interesting because now if we print out console.log food.classlist, it's going to show 2 names. So, wow, that's really interesting. We added a new class name. So blue box exists there because it's already preset in our HTML. But within JavaScript, we dynamically added a dark mode name or class name to it. That's pretty cool. And I'll show you a demo of what that really looks like in code. So assuming like we created a CSS class or a selector called .dark mode in our CSS file, and it's properly linked in our HTML, then now since it has food list has another class name, now it's going to apply dark mode styles to food list, and I'll show you what that means in a couple slides. So basically what we did here is that we went through the whole DOM of our JavaScript, starting with document, and then we got our food list through getElementById, and then we did class list. We accessed their class list, and then we utilized the add method or the function within class list to add a new class or style to our food list property or food list object on the document. Whew, that's a lot. Please don't worry if you don't get all this today, because like it's definitely a lot of information. Just definitely review these slides or refer back to this this recording again if you definitely need, because this can get very, very confusing. So yeah, that's why, again, we use the add within class list to add a string dark mode, and that's the class list that gets applied. So after adding and printing it out, we have blue box and dark mode as the two class names that exist within food list now. But there's also another function called remove. We can we can also remove class names if they exist. So here we're doing foodlist.classlist.remove and then string dark mode. So now when we print out class list, of course you guess it, we're back to the original class list of just blue box. And then we can also remove blue box if we want, and it'll be an empty list. Let's say like you're removing a non-existent name. It's just not going to do anything, that function. If the class name doesn't exist already, it's whatever. It will ignore that line basically. So let's just go through a demo again. I'm gonna use the same example as what we did. Let me show you the code first. So of course the code looks like usual. We have our UL stuff. That's what you saw before, but now we have a CSS file. Let's say we have dark mode class name, and we change this background color to black and then the text color to white, and then on the opposite hand we have light mode, which is background color white and text color black. So this is cool because I'll now show you how JavaScript can utilize these with adding and removing class from class list. So keep this in mind that we have these two CSS selectors already up. So let's just do the same thing. Food list. Oh wow, I already saved my code from last time. Okay, so now we have food list, and we use get element by ID to access it. And then let me just print out food list.class just to make sure we have our correct food list. And of course, it's just blue box right now. This is cool. So let's just do food list.class list again. But now I want to add dark mode to this, the name dark mode class to this class list. And remember, we keep in a string here and have dark mode, and it's our preset. So we add it, enter, boom. You see a change now that our background color of our food list is now black, and then the text color is white. Just what I showed you here with the CSS color. Similarly, we can do the opposite, where you could remove it. Remove, or oops, foodlist.classlist.remove dark mode, and this is going to remove these styles that we just applied, and now it's back to normal. Wait, honestly, I don't even know why I added a light mode, because this is just default stuff, but you get the gist. This is really cool. Let's say I wanted to select the first li tag. So let's do let first equals document dot query selector, because again, query selector selects the first element that exists that matches the name. So first li. So our first is now, I'm gonna print it just to make sure, it's just mezzo, the first list item. And if I wanted to like do the same thing for class list, like I add dark mode to it, then it's gonna do dark mode only for just this first object, because that's what I selected, first.classlist.add, not food list anymore. So this is really important because your homework is going to be testing you on this, and it's really, really fun and useful. This is what we mean by dynamically influencing your HTML and CSS pages. So now you have all the tools to change these styles and things on your page, not just from CSS now, but you can do it from JavaScript because it's more dynamic. So you're probably wondering like why I would do this on JavaScript when I could already do it on CSS. Again, this is the interactive functionality of our web page. This is what Nick went through last week on the lecture. So we think of it like a feature to add on our web page, like when the users click on something on the page, a button, a link, or an image, then add, change, remove, whatever, this HTML, CSS. So within this one lecture, you learn all of this. Like now we can specify which element that we want to affect or actually no, which element that is like the cause of the effect. So in this case, for a button, we can use like get element by ID or query selector to select that element that will cause a change on our page. And then the changes, now we can add, change, remove CSS on our page. So that's just done through like adding class lists, removing class lists, like the demo I just showed you. So this is a really great concept to learn about. So in the next lecture, we'll teach you about event handlers. So like how does my page know when I clicked on something, or how do I know when I hovered on something? And you're probably like, oh wait, I have the :hover pseudo selector, which works, but if you think about it, in CSS for a pseudo selector, if you do :hover, it can't affect anything other than itself. If I hover on a button and I want it to change something else, like the image size of something else, that won't work in CSS because I can only affect the button itself. So this is what's important about JavaScript. We can use the JavaScript DOM to affect other elements on the page. So this is great. Of course, you guys don't have questions. There's no one here. But hopefully you guys learned a lot through this lecture. I know it's a lot and pretty long, so please definitely go through this a couple times if you need. But this is a really, really important concept to learn about. Again, if you're really confused by this, please come to office hours or lab, anything that gets you to understand this concept better. Because again, it does snowball, and in the coming lectures, your confusion is going to be even worse if you don't understand it. So this is really important, and do the homework because it's really useful. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and have a great evening or day whenever you watch this.